Okay, I'm back up and I'm back with our final interview of the day, Shameran Abed, who is the executive director of BRAC International. Should we have a seat? Yeah. Uh, you heard Bill Easterly's conversation. Maybe you've heard some of the previous ones we've had today, Shameran. And it feels to me like this community is asking itself some pretty existential questions at the midway point of the SDGs, far off track, realizing the political winds are not necessarily in our favor. We're looking at a government shutdown in Washington, D.C., maybe in the next week or two. So I guess I want your broad take. BRAC is an unusual organization in many ways. You're the largest in the world by employees, I think 140,000 employees at your NGO. You're now in maybe 20 countries, something like that. And you lead that work overseas for BRAC. So what is your broad take on this moment we're in on the SDGs and on some of these existential questions that we're asking ourselves?
Yeah, thank you very much, Raj, and it really is good to be here. Actually, you know, many times I've said this phrase this week, this time I actually do mean it.
We feel the same way.
This week is crazy. That's a great question, and obviously for us, having worked on issues of poverty, development, illiteracy, disease for more than 50 years, coming out of a country like Bangladesh, which, you know, when it was liberated in 1971, it was one of the poorest, I think it was the second poorest country in the world. And we've worked on the development story there for the last more than half century. And you see that country now coming out of the least developed country status and moving into lower middle income status. And the work we do across sort of Asia and Africa. You know, I think, you know, if you look at the headlines, you look at obviously, you look at some of the conversations this week around the SDGs, obviously there is some, I mean, it's easy to feel a little bit down on things.
Yeah,
right?
you're telling me.
I would say this is not the time to feel hopeless, right? And if you take a longer term view of things, we've made a tremendous amount of progress across countries like ours over the last 50, 60 years, right? You know, 60 years ago in the early 1960s, there were 3 billion people in the world and 2/3 of them were in extreme poverty. 2/3 of 3 billion were in extreme poverty. We're now over 8 billion people globally and less than 10% are in extreme poverty, right? So it's somewhere between 600-700 million. If you just look at the last 20 years, we've made a huge amount of progress, right? So these 15 years of the SDGs, whether we like having goals or not, was supposed to be sort of that final push, especially on things like SDG 1, ending extreme poverty, right? Of course, we made some progress in the first few years, but then given the compounding crises of COVID and obviously climate and conflict, we've gone backwards a bit. But really, I mean, coming at it from where I am, living in the Global South and leading an organization that works across the Global South, what I'd like to say to audiences here is don't lose hope. I know the numbers don't look good right now, but there are a lot of solutions that we know work. Many solutions done by governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector. And what I would like to say to people is we need to galvanize political will and try to take things to scale. We know what works. We don't need to keep tinkering around the edges. Of course, we need to innovate continuously, but there's also a lot of innovation already that we know has tremendous evidence of success. So if we can just galvanize, I mean, I know I say just, it's not so easy, but if we can galvanize political will and take some of these solutions to scale, partnering together with governments and private sector and the civil society, I think there is a lot that we can achieve. I don't think, sorry to say, that we will get to most of these or any of these targets by 2030. We're too far down the line for that. But we can get ourselves back on track to get back on achieving some of them at some point in the future, which is not too far down the line.
So one of those solutions, Shameran, that is getting a lot of conversation here and across the development community is localization.
Yeah.
And there seems to be two buckets, local and international NGO.
Yeah.
So which one is BRAC?
Yeah. That's a great question. So we like to think of ourselves as a local organization. Now, obviously, there's a legal definition to local. BRAC in Bangladesh is, of course, local. But everywhere we work, it's not about, the way we look at it is it's how you design and develop and deliver programs, right? You can come from any country, you can be registered in the Global North or the Global South. One thing we say as a Global South organization coming out of a country like Bangladesh and going into countries like Afghanistan and then obviously countries in Asia, but then for the last 15 years working across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, is how do we make sure that we take some of the approaches and the learning and the ethos of our programmatic work, and as we go into new contexts, work with those communities to develop and deliver programs with those communities, understanding the specific needs of those communities. If we do that well, I think our programs will be high quality and they will deliver strong impact. And I think that's what we want to do, and I think we can do it at scale, partnering with many others. So for me, the global sort of this North versus South, local versus foreign, or local versus international debate, I think it's good that we're having it because so much of aid has been sort of driven from the global North, specifically, especially by the donors, and we are talking about how to sort of change that. But in terms of how you deliver it, it's really about the approach you take of working with communities and designing and delivering strong, impactful programs. And I think that's what makes us more impactful and effective and hopefully more local.
Maybe so, but I guess I wonder, are you a unicorn? Because it's a compelling vision. NGO from one global South country bringing its expertise to another in the appropriate way, understanding truly local needs, but bringing expertise from overseas. Is there another BRAC? Is this a category, or are you the only one?
I think there are other great global South organizations that are doing great work. I don't think there's anyone yet at our scale, but I hope that there will be. This is not a situation where we'd like to be the one in our category and the only one that succeeds. I think there are organizations in Asia, in Africa, and in Latin America that are growing beyond their borders. And I hope this is a trend that will take on.
It is an interesting commentary to just think that there aren't so many obvious examples yet, right?
Yeah.
It's an interesting commentary on the structure of the international development community.
I think that says more about the donors than the organizations that deliver development programs. I think it's the way the aid structure, the donor structure is, that it's very difficult to break out and become big like BRAC has been able to.
One of the things that international NGOs typically do, and you are now one, I guess, in some ways, you're in 20 countries, is they focus on growth. And I guess I wonder, do you have a different philosophy? I want to talk a bit about your approach to eradicating poverty, but how do you think about where BRAC goes as an organization?
Yeah, I think scale is extremely important for us. Coming out of, we came out of a country which has at this time 170 million people. Bangladesh is the most densely populated country in the world if you take away city-states. And we have a land size, the size roughly of New York State. So it's like putting half the people of the United States in New York State. And it's a country without any any natural resources to speak of, right? So when we started doing programming in the early 70s and we found that some of our programming was having good impact, it was very clear that unless we could scale it and take it to every village, every community, we couldn't really have an impact on numbers. I mean, infant mortality, maternal mortality, illiteracy rates, all of that needed us to go to scale along with the government and other institutions. So when we went to other countries, that's something we've been very, very focused on. We are in about 17 countries now. We might get up to about 20 countries, but we're much more interested in going deeper in the countries where we operate, rather than being in 60 or 70 countries like many of our large international NGO peers. But for us, if we can crack something, we've got to be able to take it to scale. Unless we can do that, impact at a small scale is great, but it doesn't solve a problem. We have to solve problems for a country. So we are very interested in that. The other thing I would say is, one of the issues that we're seeing a lot, and it's an increasing phenomenon, we've talked about it, is aid and the whole development situation is becoming extremely piecemeal and fragmented, right? Most of us have basically gotten into this habit of reacting to the donor, what donors want. So we react to donor calls. We get projects which happen typically are 2 to 3 years, fairly small scale, and we deliver projects, and we're really focused on compliance because that's really what the donor cares about more than impact. And there's a whole industry that has developed around ensuring compliance. And as long as you do that and you deliver, you get the next renewal. I don't think we can solve problems at scale or have impact at scale doing development like this. So it's not just about going deeper and growing. It's about taking big problems and being bold and courageous and doing things in an integrated way at scale. And that's something we're trying to do across all of the countries where we're operating. It's very challenging, I have to tell you, because that's not how things are set up.
That's not how they are. I talked to a national NGO leader today, in fact, who said, the donors are turning me into a police officer. I feel like a cop. All I'm doing is tracking down and making sure we don't do something wrong. We've had on the stage conversations about the next big idea. And one of them is cash transfers, and Rory Stewart made a compelling case for those. BRAC has its own big idea. It's not brand new, but you've been working on this for some time, and you lead this effort around a graduation out of poverty, and especially thinking of a category you define as the ultra poor. Maybe just briefly tell us, who are the ultra poor, and what is this idea of graduation?
Yeah, so the ultra poor for us, they're a subset of the extreme poor. So these are the poorest of the poor. They typically happen to be women or households where they're run by women because the man has either abandoned the family, passed away in most global south countries. But the thing about the ultra poor is they have economic vulnerabilities, social vulnerabilities, because they lack social capital. But one thing we say is they are basically stuck in a poverty trap, right? That with just normal day-to-day services, even with general cash transfer programs, they can't escape from that poverty trap, right? So to Rory and our friends at Give Directly, we would say that we are big believers in cash transfer. We think cash transfers have a lot of benefit, but when you are the ultra poor, you need more than just cash transfers. You need cash transfers, but you need a big push investment that lifts you out of the poverty trap. There is this hump that you need to get over, and the amount of programming that has been done and the amount of evidence that has been generated around this program allows us to fairly accurately even be able to measure exactly how much of an investment a household needs to be able to get over this hump. Once you do that, and then with other wraparound services, we find that even the poorest of the poor can put themselves on a pathway out of poverty, right? So the graduation program is basically an asset transfer or an investment into that household with wraparound services and a big social empowerment element, which is time-bound. It runs for 2 years typically. It's not a perennial cash transfer program. That can, as I said, can be very helpful, but usually people who get onto cash transfer programs never get out of them. This is a time-bound program, and what we've seen is the households that go through that program not only come out a lot better off, as you would imagine, but many years post what we call graduation, they continue to progress out of poverty, right? That doesn't mean that we don't need cash transfers. That doesn't mean that once they come out, they don't need social protection anymore. But it does put them on a different trajectory that is very compelling. And there's a great amount of evidence that suggests that this works.
Give us a quick sense just from a dollar standpoint. These are people earning less than 50 cents a day?
Yes. These are, I mean, now the extreme poverty rate is $2.15 a day. This would be less than, at least less than $1 a day.
Less than $1 a day.
As I said, the vulnerability of these people or these women cannot be measured just by a dollar amount.
But what is the amount of, when you talk about an asset transfer for this model, how much are we talking about that you would transfer to a household?
Yeah, so the program costs differently in different places, of course. The cost of a 2-year program in Bangladesh per household, and this includes the asset transfers and the wraparound services and the cost of actually delivering this program, is roughly between $500 and $600 per household for 2 years, right? Our friends at Bandhan in India do it at an even less, a lower amount. In East Africa, we've done the program roughly at about $1,000 per household over 2 years. In West Africa, it becomes a little more expensive. And then you go out to Latin America. I mean, we've done programming in Haiti, which is close to here, close to the US, where we've seen that they were, even some years ago, around $2,000 per household over 2 years. It varies a lot because obviously the cost of the asset, the cost of delivering all the other wraparound services, and the cost of administering the program, given how much you pay your staff and all of that, differs widely between countries, but that's the range.
And I think what's particularly exciting about it, it's a bit like Bill Gates has been questioned sometimes. You know, there are skeptics about the big investments, billions he's investing into polio eradication. And his argument is, yes, it might seem an enormous sum per case because there's so few cases left in the world, but the day that it's over, that polio is eradicated, we get all the benefit of saving on polio vaccination campaigns that happen all over the world. And it's similar in this case, right? If graduation lives up to its name, it can truly be transformative.
Look, at this moment, there are about 600 to 700 million people in extreme poverty, right? Of which we estimate that maybe 300 to 400 million of these people are ultra poor. That's, like, let's say 100 million households. If you take 4 members to a household, which is low, actually households have more. But let's say there are 100 million households in ultra poverty. Even if we put all of them through a graduation program, and let me just say they don't all need to go through a graduation program. There are many other programs and other things governments do that will lift some of them up. But even if we put 100 million people through the graduation program at, let's say, an average of $1,000, right, it would cost $100 billion. Right?
For a permanent elimination.
To take them out of poverty over, and $100 billion is money that individuals have. Forget governments, forget multilateral development banks. There are people on this planet with over $100 billion. Now there are several of them. Okay, the issue, of course, is not that the money doesn't exist. Even countries in the global south, countries like ours, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Indonesia, Philippines, countries in Africa, Ethiopia, Nigeria, they're spending large amounts of their annual budgets on large-scale government programs, right? We are basically now saying that if we could just get the programs to be more effective and better targeted, we could get much better impact, much better bang for your buck, right? So even before we put in more money, and of course we would welcome more money into anti-poverty programs, but there are ways to make existing financing go much further. And if we take some of the evidence we have and the learning we have about what works and what doesn't, and we apply them to large-scale government programs, I think we'll see a big shift.
Well, we started this discussion with your entreaty to all of us to not lose hope. And I think you just gave us an example why we shouldn't, that there are solutions out there that work. Please join me in thanking Shameran Abed, BRAC International Executive Director.
Thank you very much.